We are more interested into job transformation. Scriptwriters in 10 years probably will not look like it's scriptwriting now. Probably they will spend less time writing words. Probably they will spend more time plotting the story.
Hello and welcome to ESCP Edge, the video podcast series that brings you insights from ESCP professors at the forefront of business research. My name's Nick Taylor, and today I'm joined by Louis-David Benyayer, who is the Associate Professor of Information and Operations Management at ESCP and the school's coordinator of AI initiatives. Louis-David, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to start by just introducing yourself a little bit and telling us about your field of research?
Yes, sure. So I'm based in Paris, in the Paris campus, and I am involved in digital transformation at large, let's put it that way. I'm really interested and passionate about how digital technologies, Internet of Things, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, agentic AI are transforming the way companies are creating and capturing value. And what does it change to competition dynamics? And this is something that I've been researched about for about a decade. And I need to say that we're kind of lucky in our field because almost every week something big is happening.
Completely. I mean, it's the biggest news story in business and in technology and in other cultural things as well. However, there seems to be a bit of a tension right now between the promise of AI and the investment in AI and what it might actually be delivering for businesses in terms of value. I wondered if you'd looked into that and whether you could tell us about the successful strategies some companies may be using for turning AI into value, as opposed to those who are just running experiments and not really pinning down how they're going to make money out of it.
Yeah, well, that's a very broad question, right? So let's try to address the first part, right? To unpack a little bit that promises versus reality thing, I guess, right? So it's true that the amount of money invested is now piling up to hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And people are starting to say, well, will we get anytime soon any return on our investment, right? And I think the debate is quite fair because there's currently a disconnect between the two orders of magnitudes, right? Tenfold more into investment compared to what is brought yet into value, right? So I don't have the true reality of figures, and I can't say and I can't forecast, right? Otherwise, probably I wouldn't be there if I were better at forecasting, right? So my view is that it's something that we've been already facing with technology as a lag between the time when the technology emerges and the time when it transferred into productivity improvements, for example. This is something historians have documented quite intensively about electricity, for example. When electricity started in the late 19th century, it took a bit of decades before there has been a gap in productivity. Something that we can all connect with is when a technology arrives, what are we doing? We're trying to improve how we're currently doing things. So when electricity arrived in craftsmanship, people were using it to save money on candles and to light the craftsmanships 1 hour more a day, right? So of course, it brings some improvement, right? You're saving money on candles, you're having a 1 hour additional time for producing, but that's not transformative, right? It took a bit of time before real process innovation came into operation, such as the assembly line, where it was no longer the people that were moving around the product, but the product that were moving around the people. And that triggered off massive productivity improvement. So the optimistic view of that disconnect between the investment in technology and their impact as it takes some time for companies to transform, to reorganize themselves so that they can leverage the technology for massive productivity improvements. So that's maybe one reason or maybe one explanation that we could see, right? But there are also other explanations, and maybe those amounts are too big compared to the outcome that will be generated. Time will tell. we can't say yet if my lag hypothesis would prove right, or if, like for other technologies such as the metaverse, the promises have been super high and then the reality is a bit glimmer. So we'll see. But there is something else that maybe can explain that frustration about productivity improvement, is that what we observe in digital technologies and AI in particular is that, of course, there is some productivity improvement because we're saving time on doing things. Decisions are made quicker with a higher level of quality. But at the same time, the use of the technology triggers some new tasks. And this is also something quite interesting, right? Because there was something very significant happened 2 years ago, right? In 2024, 2 Nobel Prizes were awarded to computer scientists. But as you know, there is no Nobel Prize for computer science, right? One of them has been awarded in physics to a team who was being composed also by Geoffrey Hinton. He's a computer scientist and he pioneered neural networks 20 years ago. And he's famous for a lot of things, but 10 years ago, in 2016, he said, given the rapid progress of computer vision, the ability of a computer to analyze a picture, we will no longer need radiologists because the technology is progressing so fast that we no longer need those people watching the radios to make the diagnosis. Well, he's Geoffrey Hinton. He's a Nobel Prize winner, but the truth is that 10 years after, in the UK, the number of radiologists grew by 40%. So what happened? He's a Nobel Prize winner, right? So, well, when you look at the figures, there are 2 things that happened. First, in order to use AI for radiologists to perform their tasks, there are new tasks required. You need to train the algorithm. You need to fine-tune it to certain certificates, to certain use cases or particularities. You need to train yourself on how to use the AI systems. In a nutshell, new tasks emerge for radiologists. But there is another thing that we've also been exposed to in other contexts, is the rebound effect. As it's quicker and faster and cheaper to have radios being diagnosed by the AI, we do more of them. So even if individually there is a productivity boost, when you take globally, if you grow by 10 times or 100 times the number of radios, well, you need more radiologists. So you see, this discussion about progresses, productivity improvement, is necessary to unpack a little bit to understand a bit more clearly what could happen. But it's true to say that for the moment, time will tell what will be the case for artificial intelligence.
I wonder, picking up one of the other parts of that first question of mine, whether there are specific companies or strategies within companies that you could point to where this is being managed well, the integration of the technology. And I'm thinking possibly in order to make the technology really, really valuable, you probably need other things in your company. You know, you need very, very good data sets, for instance, or you need to decide whether you're going to build your own large language model or use somebody else's. I wondered if it was too early to say what the right strategies were there, or whether there was some inkling of that.
Well, as always, there are several ways of failing and several ways of winning, right? So I'm not sure I still have the perfect recipe, but I think there are 2 or 3 things that we can already see as clear patterns. First, you need to master the technology. It seems a bit natural or evident, but for non-digital native companies, mastering digital technologies is not a challenge, but requires a bit of efforts and investment because it's something totally different. Think about the car makers that since 10 years are now turning themselves into software producers because the car runs on software. Well, that's not super easy, right? When you've been building your company for 100 years on designing and manufacturing cars, and now someone is knocking at the door and saying, hey, you're now software producer. You can imagine that's not super easy to manage. So that's the first thing, right? But then there are always humans that are using technology, right? Making decisions or designing the cars. And then you need somehow to train your staff on the use of that technology so that they understand their powers, but also their limits so that they can use them wisely, right? Wisely meaning for the sake of value creation for the company. And that's also another very important part, because I'm picking again my example of the car makers. You can imagine that turning your mechanical engineers into software engineers is not that super easy, right? So you need somehow a bit of training of the staff. But the most important part is connected to what I said earlier, is you need to reorganize your processes in order to leverage the technology. And that's the hardest part. The other two parts requires time and effort. It's a bit of muscle, right? But the other part is a bit more subtle to manage, right? How do you reorganize your processes so that you can leverage the technology? So this is something that we've been researching on in many different topics and contexts. For example, I investigated that into consulting, right? With artificial intelligence, how does the consulting business change? And we can see already that there are some massive changes around this. We also had a research on script writers that are using generative AI for producing their scripts. This is also another question about what does it change the process of script making? So there are several ways of winning. There are several ways of failing. But as you were hinting, it's about combining different types of resources and capabilities. And this is what is strategy about. Combination of resources and capabilities. Data sets is obviously one of the key resources that companies need to leverage. And it's common to say that no data, no AI. If you can't rely on good quality data at scale, you can't really leverage artificial intelligence. And that's also something pretty hard for those non-digital native companies.
You mentioned there script writing and how AI could impact that. That's a fascinating topic that I've heard. No, I've never seen any research about that. How did that project come about? What did it surface?
Well, it started because we're looking for edge cases, right? Sometimes when we're starting to see a phenomenon exploring. So let's see at the edges and basically generative artificial intelligence produces text. So we wanted to see, for those whose job is to produce text, what does it change? And script writing is about producing text. And then I was discussing with some colleagues, and one of them is super well connected with script writers, and said, "Okay, let's go and see. Let's interview a bunch of them." So this is how it started, and we have made a lot of interviews with those professional script writers, and it was really, really super interesting. And among the things that we discovered along the way is the fact that the generative AI tools don't play the same roles all along the steps of script writing. And that was something that we hadn't expected, that there was different roles associated explicitly or implicitly by the scriptwriters to the generative AI tools. And the other things that we discovered is what I just mentioned earlier, is that the fact that they're using generative AI, of course, helps them to save a bit of time on some tasks, but it triggers some new tasks. And that's why probably the promises of productivity are a bit, let's say, exaggerated if you just count on the pluses, but not the minuses, right? That's a really, really interesting, let's say, research, or we're super interested into it. And actually, it spans much broader than only script writing. And I think what we see with that field is the transformation of jobs. Script writers in 10 years probably will not look like it's script writing now. Question mark is, what will it look like, right? And what will be the job of those script writers? Probably they will spend less time writing words. Probably they will spend more times plotting the story. Probably they will spend more time engaging with stakeholders to define their story. But that's emerging. We don't have yet the answers, but I think this is what's particularly interesting for us, is that it sheds some light on how jobs are changing with AI. And we're escaping a bit that discussion of job destruction, and we are more interested into job transformation. And I think it's, first, it's what we observe, and it's super interesting to see what does it change.
I want to talk more about job transformation, but before we leave this scriptwriter example, it's so fascinating. I mean, I think immediately I'm interested in whether the scriptwriter is going to find the AI a creatively relevant tool, or whether the scriptwriter can offload some more mundane tasks to the AI while they focus on the pure creativity. And it seemed like you said it's used in different ways at different stages in the process. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's pretty clear that it writes faster, right? But actually, when it comes to creativity, it's not only about thinking and writing, right? The process engages into different types of back and forth, right? And creative people are doing very different things during the creative process, right? So they are playing roles, one with each other. They're trying to get some feedback on their work. They're trying. So in that sense, and it's been well documented in other research, generative AI tools can be used as a support in that process. For example, we discussed with some of them, they had developed agents that would play a given role during the process. So for example, one of them had developed one agent that would be always opposing his ideas, another agent that would be the nasty producer. And as he was preparing the script, he was throwing the ideas or the preliminary works to those agents that would play a role to give him feedback, right? So that's not exactly the same thing as, okay, I'm thinking about this, please write me the lines, right? It's a different type of thing.
Totally different thing.
And in that way, I think it's and once again, it's what people are doing, right? We're not fantasizing about what they should do. It's what they're telling us that they do, right? So I think it's super interesting because it shows that professionals like what they do. So they want to continue doing it. And usually when they see the technology appearing, they don't think about let's outsource because they like the job. They like telling stories. They like building plots. So usually what they do is, how can we use this to do an even more satisfying job than we were doing? And I think that's also super, let's say, interesting because when you look at the direct users, very few of them consider the technology as their little outsourcer, right? Or, of course, it happens, but that's not the majority. Usually, a lot of people are trying to use them to extend their impact more than reducing their workload.
Right. Well, then let's talk a bit more about AI and possible threats to the workforce. I love this attitude you have of people liking their jobs, people wanting to use the technology to enable them to have more impact, to enable them to be more productive, perhaps, or simply faster. What can you tell us about other professions that are more traditional and how AI may threaten the workforce, maybe entry-level jobs, maybe more senior jobs? What does your research tell us about that?
It's true that for a lot of tasks, machines can probably do a better job than humans in terms of length or duration and sometimes in terms of quality. But we know that jobs are not only tasks. And for a given job or occupation, there are several tasks. And as long as you can't automate all tasks, you still need people to do part of the task that you can't automate, right? So once again, it's about my view is about transformation of jobs, right? However, it's true that there is a current challenge or discussion about how do we deal with that massive automation of tasks, and in particular for entry-level jobs, because we know that a lot of entry-level jobs are about synthesizing information, preparing reports, interviewing people, doing some preliminary work, preparing dashboards, so that other people could, for example, make decisions, right? And we know that for those people that are at entry-level jobs, doing all those tasks is a way to help them getting better at the job because they understand the details of it. So it's not only about producing something, being a producer of reports. It's also that doing this, you gain experience and you get more knowledgeable about the things. The problem is, if you automate all of those tasks, maybe you save a bit of time with those entry-level jobs, but you're losing a training opportunity. And companies are pretty, let's say, they see reality clearly. They know that the experts for tomorrow are the young of today. So if tomorrow they need some expertise, they have no other choice than recruiting young and grooming them in. The question is how you groom them when you no longer have the financial incentive to trust them with those tasks that can be made. So I think this is the major question that I have, and the discussion I have with people in charge of those transformation processes. Very few, if any of them, are telling me, hey, that's great. We no longer need to train or to recruit entry level, because they know that's a very short-sighted view. Because in 1 year, they will need the 1 year experienced guy, right? So how do you solve that problem? So now what they are thinking about is, okay, but now what is it that we're going to trust our entry-level recruits with if it's no longer synthesizing, summarizing, preparing dashboards? That's a very difficult question, I would say, but this is the question that they're addressing, and this is the way they're seeing it. So that's one part of the reality. Another part of the reality is that it's true that for some given jobs and occupations, the volume of demand will go down. Think about translation. Of course, we'll still need translators, but probably we'll need less hours of translators because their role will probably change from writing the translation to correcting it or to choosing the right model for the right context. But that requires to be a very good translator to do this. But it's likely that for the same amount of words translated, we will need less hours of them. But that puts a lot of pressure on the people whose job is to be a translator. And that's of course, one part of the reality of, it's not only about job transformation, there is some job destruction for some given specific. And now as a society, well, we need to take that into account. If we need less translators, maybe we should train less of them. That's for the education part. But also maybe we should try and find ways to have the current translators move into other occupations. That's a very big societal problem, but I think this is unavoidable, and we will need to face this collectively because those translators, I'm taking the example of translators, but of course it's not limited to them, they have some skills that are transferable into other contexts. But that requires a bit of time and effort to scratch the surface and say, okay, it's not only about translating words, what you know, right? It's about understanding a context, for example. It's about dealing with stakeholders that are urging you into the... So how can we move those skills and how can we use them into another context? Well, that's a bit of a big question, but I think this is something we'll be facing as a society.
These are changes that have happened in the past with automation. Perhaps it feels different now because it's very much happening to white-collar jobs and not necessarily just manual labor, which has been automated in the past. I wondered whether this changed the kinds of things you're equipping your students with at ESCP, whether it's changed the sorts of skills that you think are going to be really, really necessary for the business leaders of tomorrow.
Yes and no. It does change because, as I said, it's a tech question and you need to understand the technology. So we're increasing the exposure of our students to the technology itself. So we have more courses on the technology side. So that's one of the changes, growing the share of time so that they are knowledgeable on the technology and not only that they can explain how artificial intelligence works. How do you train a model? That's super important that our students are aware, even if they're not expert or they cannot do it by themselves, that they are expert enough to understand So that's one thing that changes a little bit. So we're growing that fast. On the other side of the pendulum, we're growing all the non-tech related skills. If more and more jobs if more and more tasks are automated, we need humans for what is particularly human, right? Social and emotional skills. Well, leadership, having people and say, hey, let's conquer that part of the world. You won't do this by an AI, right? It's because you have a leadership skill that when you look back, you have people behind you, right? Because if you say, oh, let's conquer, and there's no one, right? So we need that kind of skills too. So we're also very conscious that we need to equip our students with particularly human skills, social, emotional ones. How do you communicate? How do you understand cultural differences? Translation and cultural differences are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? But if you're only good at translating, maybe you're missing totally the point of the conversation. And then there are two other things that we are equipping our students with as critical thinking and analytical mindset. Of course, machines can analyze variables in a quicker way, but still it requires human to orient the machines into meaningful directions. And this requires some very internal critical thinking, analytical mindset. And then there is a last part, and it's not by order of importance, right? But it's more about the connection of the field topic that we're discussing today, as you need to be good at something, right? So you need to be good either at finance, marketing, supply chain, whatever, but you need to be good at something, domain expertise. So this is the directions that we're into now. Tech skills, growing tech skills, growing social and emotional skills, growing critical thinking, analytical mindset skills, and also domain expertise. And that's a bit of the mix that we're engaged in.
I was reading some of your research, and it was talking about the idea of big data and the idea of without data, you can't have AI. But there was an idea that maybe too much data in certain contexts can actually hold you back, which is something I'd never really heard before. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's because I was looking into those big data things 10 years ago, and then when someone told me, but sometimes you don't need data, right? I say, maybe he's right? So, and we're sharing some examples of situations where people are making decisions, and good decisions, without any information, right? And we also saw some people that were putting the data out, like runners, professional runners, marathon runners. And you know that we have all those devices that measure all what can be measured by seconds, so you can analyze your sessions, and analyzing them modify your practice, right? This is super data-driven approach. But we started seeing people, professional ones, that were saying, I no longer wear that watch. And I no longer look at the detailed data. I rely on my feelings, the way I feel when I'm doing the run, which is exactly the opposite of a data-driven approach of someone that would digest the Excel spreadsheet in the night to prepare the morning session, right? People were saying, well, we're no longer into this. So that's super interesting, right? Because those situations, some people were saying, well, you're better off if you rely on your intuition. And then COVID happened. And of course, no companies could rely on their AI forecasting tools, because the forecasting tools were predicting that tomorrow they should sell that number of products, but no one was able to buy them on the streets, right? So it was an evident, let's say, testimony of sometimes, even if you have massive data sets, it's useless. So all in all, we were just discussing that idea, and what we can take out of those examples is that when there is a high level of uncertainty, probably relying on past data is not super relevant. The higher the level of uncertainty, the lower the relevance of detailed and granular data. And that makes sense, right? If we take the COVID example, I think it's a very clear example that we all have faced. High level of uncertainty. How long will that last? What will be the impact? Well, companies that thrived were the companies that didn't look at their spreadsheets and say, okay, here is the forecast. They did things differently. They probably entered into more agile practices. Let's try and see. Let's test and see. They probably relied also on their cultural norms and what they believed in, right? We're supporting our community. And this is what we'll do, what we'll use to base our actions more than previous data, right? And some of them were saying, okay, let's try to find other ways, being creative, right? And let's do other things. So, for example, restaurants that decided that they would become just a kitchen and no longer a place where people would come. So all of these are examples of all of these decisions are not based on any data or analysis, right? It's people facing an uncertain event that are dealing with this, and they're relying on other things, that big data, to sort them out.
Fascinating. I love this idea of runners who are throwing away the data, and I wonder whether their performance improves, whether you could point to absolutely world-class athletes who were not data-driven at all.
Well, the article that I'm referring to as a New York Times one, that were using those professional athletes that were in the higher league of the US Championship. So those are people that are, for example, competing for entering the Olympics game team. So they're world-class athletes, we can say, because they're in that group of people which are competing during the Olympics, right? So that's a clear signal of their commitment and the quality of...
Yeah, and they're going to be motivated by picking whatever works best for them.
Exactly.
And if this works best, then they're going to use it.
Exactly.
You recently organized a summit about AI in higher education. What was behind that event?
Well, the school is super engaged in artificial intelligence. Of course, it's a topic we're training our students on, but also it changes pretty much all the jobs in business, right? So we're also engaging into the discussion into what does it change to marketing, what does it change to HR, human resource. But there is another side, is that with generative AI, it's a challenge for us because we can no longer teach our students the same way we did, and we can no longer assess them the same way we did. So we're into that digital transformation thing that we were observing, and now we're facing it directly.
Just to clarify, do you mean because it's easier than ever for somebody to get a machine to write their papers for them and do their research?
Yeah, for sure. And some of the students, of course, some of them, they just want to have things done quickly without any effort, right? But some others are quite, let's say, sincere in their approach, right? The technology exists, why not using it? Which makes total sense, right? We would be crazy just to say the opposite. But it's true that it challenges the way we were teaching and the way we're assessing them. So we had a lot of discussions. You know that the school has been the first to open the doors of OpenAI to all of our students, and we brought that ChatGPT EDU license to our 10,000 students. So we're pretty engaged into that direction. But at the same time, we're very, let's say, conscious of the limits and the risks. So we want to develop a responsible approach, right? So as we were discussing all of these, we of course had many discussions with some of our peers, other universities in the world that were facing the same challenges. We say, okay, we've had those random conversations one-on-one. Let's bring everyone on the same room for a couple of days, right? And let's have the broader scope as we can imagine, right? So we said higher education, which means teaching, researching, and also administrative processes. And we also said it's not only about business school, right? So we brought in also engineering schools, medical schools, human sciences, etc. And for 2 days, we had more than 40 contributions coming from all over the world with great keynote speakers. And we were discussing about that question, how should university evolve in a world where AI and generative AI is available 24/7. That was a great event. We had several hundreds of participants coming from all over the world. Of course, we don't have answers to all questions, but we did share a lot of examples, a lot of case studies that collectively help us to navigate into that situation we're in, which is a transformation situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a transformative technology, and it's transforming so many aspects of society, the workplace, education. I think you're going to have to come back to the podcast and speak again when maybe some of these ideas have developed even further. But thank you so much, Louis-David Benyayer, Associate Professor of Information and Operations Management at ESCP. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for joining us. This was ESCP Edge. Join us next time for more fascinating discussions at the forefront of business research.